Today's program is a recorded version of a workshop which we run at Surrey Place in Toronto, Ontario. Now we'll talk about how FASD affects learning. FASD does affect some of the brain's functions. The functions affected are information processing, so that's information moving from one part of the brain to another, motor functioning, learning, memory, and impulse control. The following are areas that your child may require your help in: memory, communication, cognitive and auditory processing, abstract thinking, and executive functioning. Not everyone with FASD will have the same performance areas affected. So your child with FASD may not have all these performance areas affected and may not have challenges in all these areas. But what we'll do today is we'll go through these different areas and we'll talk about how these might be affecting your child's life, what your child's strengths might be in these areas, and finally we'll talk about how we can start helping your child right now in these areas. I really like this quote. It's from the Asante Center in British Columbia. I burn out faster because my brain is working really fast, really hard, all the time. This might be a quote that speaks to you. You may have a child with FASD, maybe comes home from school at the end of a long day of having lots of demands placed on them, and also having to focus and do a lot of things that are very taxing for their brain, and just come home just burnt out, and maybe it's easy to get angry, might have tantrums, might have rages where they throw things or they trash their room. They may even sleep for longer periods of time than the rest of the family. And that's because their brain is working very hard just to keep up with everyone else. Okay, the first performance area we'll talk about today is memory. And memory is not just remembering information, but it's also making use of information, making connections between bits of information as well. So your child with FASD may have difficulty with remembering what someone said to them, not learning from negative consequences. So if they do something they're not supposed to do and they're scolded or they're punished or something is taken away from them, those consequences may not have a large effect on them doing that thing again in the future. So being punished doesn't take away or doesn't decrease the likelihood that they'll do that thing they're not supposed to do again. And even the law, right? So the law is based on consequence. So if you do something, then you do the crime, then you have to do the time. And so these kind of consequence-based strategies with kids with FASD are not very effective. And that leads us to, they may make a mistake and then not really learn from the mistake and keep making the mistake over and over again. Next, we'll talk about strengths. So in the area of memory, what we'd ask you to do is write down one or more strengths that your child does have. Maybe you have a pad of paper or a notebook or a journal where you keep all your FASD information. So it's important to note and update yourself on your child's strengths. So even though your child may be having difficulty in these areas, it's recommended that you update yourself with some of the strengths that they may have in these areas. And there's 3 reasons for that. First is knowing your child's strengths makes it easier to identify areas of need. Second is it makes you a better advocate when you're talking to other adults that may be involved in your child's life about what your child is able to do. So knowing their strengths might help those people play to your child's strengths and interests when they're teaching them new things, or they're maybe teaching a new skill, or they're providing new information. And then they might modify their class or their environment to better engage your child. And third is knowing your child's strengths will help direct you to appropriate resources. So you might be on a wait list for something like, let's say, speech language pathology, and once you find out what the goals are that they work on and you cross-reference them with your child's strengths, you might realize that you don't really need that service. And so being placed on a wait list for something you don't need is wasting your time, right, and your energy. And it might hopefully direct you to seek out services that are more relevant to your child's needs. So the first strategy for helping a child with FASD that may have short-term memory issues is reminders. In classrooms or in homes, sometimes there might be a rule where the adult says it once, and then if you didn't hear it, then too bad, so sad. Well, that doesn't help a child with FASD, especially if they have memory issues. We want to make sure that in our environments, whether it be the classroom or home, that it's okay to give a child with FASD reminders. We don't want to punish them for having challenges with their memory. So we want to be very patient. Another good strategy to help with memory issues is that when we're providing instructions, we don't want to also tag on a consequence. So if you better put on your shoes, or so-and-so, or this will be taken away. So that's adding on a consequence to an instruction. As we spoke about before, we're seeing that consequence-based strategies or anything to do with consequences with a child with FASD, it's not very effective in either increasing a behavior or decreasing a behavior. What's much more effective is if we offer a lot of opportunities where they can do that thing that you want them to be good at doing, or maybe it's a particular instruction. We want to give them opportunities so that they do repetitively. So maybe it could be once a day, or maybe every time they do a certain routine, and we're offering support so that they're following through on that instruction, or they're doing this particular thing you want them to do successfully. And so it's much more effective if at the start of an instruction or demand, you're providing that support to make them successful and following through, especially if there's multiple steps. And what happens is over time, the more they do something, the better they'll become at doing it. A child with FASD learns just like everyone else very effectively through repetition. So for us, maybe tying our shoes as a child may have been very daunting, and it may have been something that was very hard to learn at first. Maybe we even used a rhyme to remember what to do when we're tying our shoes. But over time, the more we tied our shoes, we built those neural pathways in our brain. And so now when we tie our shoes, we're not using a lot of brain power anymore, and it's like the hands know what to do. Maybe it's even driving to work. You might forget how you got to work this morning because you've done it so many times. The hands, the feet know what to do, and you're not exerting a lot of brain power or even memory, and so, or short-term memory. And so it's the same with a child with FASD. So if it's effective for a child with FASD to learn this way, we want to provide lots of support to make those repetition opportunities happen. And when we're providing those opportunities, we're doing it in a very supportive way. So we're not making them do it over and over and over again during the same routine, but we're providing support every time we do that routine for them to be successful with this particular instruction or thing that you want them to learn. It could be during part of the morning routine, you want them to be able to put on their coat by themselves, or if you have a preteen, you want him to or her to be successful in hanging up their backpack on the coat rack when they come home from school, those kinds of things. They seem very simple, but for a child with FASD, they might need some support over time to be successful with doing those things. And then over time, you can start to fade your support. You want to keep in mind, though, that with children with FASD and individuals with FASD, fading your support is a much longer process than with a typically developing child or individual. So you may have to offer your support during these things or instructions for a longer period of time. The next performance area that may be affected in a child with FASD is communication. And communication is just sending or receiving information. An individual with FASD may have difficulty understanding instructions and the meaning of words, even when they are highly skilled verbally. So they might be really good public speakers or be able to tell a story really well or a joke. But when it's the other way around, when they have to understand words that are being told to them, they might have difficulty understanding that information. It's what we call receptive communication, when you're listening and taking in that information and sort of understanding what someone else is saying. Because of communication challenges, a child with FASD might agree to something that they don't understand, and then they don't follow through on it. And they didn't follow through on it not because they're being lazy or they're avoiding doing something. It's because they may not have understood when they agreed to it, right? So they may not have understood properly. They may also confabulate. I'll go over the meaning of confabulation, but they may cover sometimes for things that they missed and don't understand, and it might appear to us like they're lying. I found this definition on Google. They describe confabulation as a memory error defined as the production of fabricated, distorted, or misinterpreted memories about oneself or the world without the conscious intention to deceive. So confabulation occurs in all of us. It's those memory errors. It's when we don't really remember what someone wore maybe in one of our memories that we're relaying to someone, or we might be quoting someone improperly because we don't remember the exact words, but our brain is filling in those empty spots, those empty areas in our memory with other information. It could be information from a movie we saw even, or even another memory. And so people confabulate all the time. So you can imagine that a child with FASD who already has memory issues, confabulation is going to occur a lot more. And so when they're telling you a story and they get the facts wrong, it might look like they're trying to lie to us, or there's an intention to deceive, but really it's a memory error, and it's being relayed through their communication, and it's making them look like they're being dishonest. And it can happen in really strange ways. So a child might tell you that they brushed their teeth, and when you go and look at their toothbrush, the toothbrush is dry, and so you know they didn't just brush their teeth, and you might argue with them, and then the child becomes very adamant, they stomp their feet, they might start to cry, and they really believe that they just brushed their teeth. And what may be really happening is that they're remembering brushing their teeth from yesterday. So it gets very tricky, and we just want to keep in mind that when it looks like they're not telling the truth, that confabulation might be occurring. They could also be covering, right, for things that they don't remember. They might be embarrassed that they don't remember something, and so they might be giving you any information, just so that they'll fill in an expectation of answering or giving you an answer. So they might be confabulating, or they might be covering. Their intent is not to deceive, it's not to lie. So in communication, again, if you can note one or more strengths or interests that your child may have in this area. Your child might be a great public speaker, or might really like telling stories. They might have an interest in jokes or humor. And so those are all things that we can count as strengths, and things that we can play with and play to when we're teaching our child. So one strategy is to use simple language, especially when we're delivering you instructions, right? Something that they've never done before, or when we're giving you information. It could be maybe granddad moved away, that's new information, and we're not going to see him on a weekly basis anymore. And so a child with FASD may not really understand what that is, and then get mad when Wednesday rolls around and we don't go see granddad. They may not have understood when we first told them granddad moved away, and so that also means that we're not going to see him every Wednesday. Another strategy you could use is to ask them to show you after you tell them something, or to say back in their own words what you've just told them. That gives them an opportunity and gives them more time to process the information that you just gave them. They're kind of showing themselves, right? As they do it, they're thinking about it, they're processing it, and it might make it more concrete to them. That being said, saying back in their own words something you just told them may not always be an effective strategy, because they might just repeat what you just told them without really processing that information. Which leads us to the next performance area that might be effective, and that's cognitive and auditory processing. Cognitive processing is taking in information, transforming it, storing it, recovering it, and putting it to work. And auditory processing is taking in sound through the ear and having it travel to the language area of the brain to be interpreted. These two areas might be affected and might be a lot slower than individuals that do not have FASD. So a child with FASD might have difficulty with responding on time, right? They might be slow to answer. They might give an answer right away, any answer, just to cover, just to save face. They might jump down your throat before they've actually understood what you've asked them. You may have asked them something really easy to do, and they might jump down your throat and say things like, "You're always telling me what to do, you're always giving me all these demands," but really what you asked them might have been something very simple. They just haven't had time to process it yet. And they may also appear aloof or apathetic in certain social situations. So you might see that with pre-adolescents or teens, maybe social gatherings like Thanksgiving dinner, and there's all these new family members they've never met before, a big extended family, and they might just go off to the side because it might be way too much information for them to process, and stimulation and all those things like social cues, what people are saying, people's facial expressions as well. They may not understand all these conversations that are going on. If you're from a different family, you might be using a different kind of vocabulary that you might use in your own home, and so there's words that they may never have heard, and it just becomes very overwhelming for a child with FASD, and so they might just step outside, or they might freeze, or they might go sit on the couch somewhere in another room. To us, it might look like they're being rude or antisocial, but their brain might just be taking a break, or it may not be able to think of a way to interact with everyone appropriately. Some with cognitive and auditory processing as well, so having difficulty processing information, might follow through on instructions improperly. So in the area of cognitive and auditory processing, your child may have some strengths or some interests. So it's important to note those as well. So we want to give children and teens with FASD time to process information. We want to make sure that we're parsing it in an appropriate manner, and that we're giving them time to process that information before they act on that information. Be patient when you give them something, or you give them an instruction, or you ask them a question, and wait for them to process that information before they respond back to you. And that also includes avoiding rapid fire orders, right? So if you ask your child to do something and you know they have difficulty with following through on instructions, then I would just keep it one instruction at a time. Wait till they follow through on the instruction, and then you deliver the other instruction. At the same time, you want to be aware of overloading and overwhelming. If they're having difficulty processing information and processing sound and turning that into information, we want to make sure that we're not overwhelming them with tons of information all at once, right? So we're single core processors, human beings, and we're actually not able to multitask. And multitask is an illusion. If someone's multitasking, all they're doing is they're just doing a few seconds of something, and then they're jumping and doing something else for a few seconds. And even that jumping from one task to another is very taxing on any brain. And so you could just imagine with someone with cognitive and auditory processing, how much harder that is. And we could all use a little slowing down. If you live in a home that's very active and very busy and overloading our schedules, and we're running from one thing to another, and it's very hectic, for a child with FASD, that's a lot. Any kind of new thing happening, that's a piece of information that they have to process now. And so when we slow down, we're also slowing down all this stuff that's coming at them. It'll actually help everyone, right, in the family. Okay, our next area that we're going to talk about is abstract thinking. Abstract thinking is thinking about things that aren't physically right in front of you. So that could be concepts, time, money. Those are all abstract things, right? They're things that represent something else, or they're just abstract in nature. So a child with FASD may have difficulty managing money. This is something that someone with FASD will likely require support with their entire lives. They may have difficulty managing time, planning for the future, right? Seeing the future, that's abstract because it's not really in front of us. And you could see now why things like consequences, like if you do this, then this will happen. You could see how that could be problematic for someone with FASD, how they may not really understand what that consequence will be. If someone tells us, if you do this, you're going to go to jail, some of us are able to see and feel what jail might feel like, right? A terrible place, you don't get to do what you want to do, and terrible things might happen in jail. And so we're able to change our behavior based on something that may happen in the future. For some with FASD, they may not be able to see or think about what something in the future will feel or look like. And so planning for the future is not something that someone with FASD can easily do. And anytime that we're asking them to think about the future, we want to make sure that they're not going to think about the future the way we tend to do it. Also, someone with FASD may have difficulty with complex symbolic language, like metaphors and sarcasm, and concepts and systems. So things like token systems. So if you've ever been part of a behavior plan for your child where you use token systems, you might be familiar with how that works. So if a child earns 10 tokens, so 10 tokens gives you a prize. That takes planning for the future. And so token systems, and it's also it's very abstract to work towards something. For someone with FASD, a token system may not be effective. It could be, but we want to keep in mind that it may not be effective because of their difficulty with abstract thinking. And things like the justice system. So we already talked about that, where they may not know what something will feel like in the future. So to threaten something in the future, like going to jail, may not be very effective for someone who has difficulty with abstract thinking. In terms of abstract thinking, your child may have strengths that require abstract thinking or even interests. So you also want to maybe take note of that. So when we're teaching things that are abstract, like concepts like money, we want to use real concrete objects to teach those things. So with money, using coins, using paper money, actual money, just showing them that you either have enough money to buy the thing that you want or you don't have enough money. That's much more effective than a number on a screen. And for someone with FASD, planning ahead with money, that's going to be very difficult. It's much more easier, especially with a child, if they have that concrete money in front of them. And it's really good to start teaching money in that manner. So they may have a piggy bank where they're putting all their money in, and then a second piggy bank where they're just putting their money for something that they're saving for. You want to avoid complex language like metaphors and sarcasm. Anytime that we say something or we use words, but we're not using the words in a proper way. So that leads us to say what you mean. So they're not going to be able to read your tone sometimes or understand that you're saying a joke that you don't really mean what you're saying. And we also don't want them to assume that they'll understand hints that you've added to something that you're saying, or eye rolls or sarcasm. And say exactly what you want, right? So if you expect them to pick up after themselves, or anytime they're downstairs and there's laundry in the dryer, anyone who's down there should be bringing it up. You want to say that to them. You don't want to assume that they'll know what the expectation is just because of what's happened in the past, or what's customary in your family, or because they've seen you do it over and over again, they won't know that this is what you want of them. So you want to make sure that if this is an expectation you have of them, that you say it to them. I like this quote. It's from the Asante Center, and it says, "Show me that asking for help is okay." And that's really important for someone with FASD. When we show them that asking for help is okay, it makes them better self-advocates. Again, if we go back to certain classrooms might have a rule where I say it once, and if you didn't hear me or you didn't know that I was talking to you, then too bad, so sad. So what we want to do is we want to make our child feel that it's okay, that if you didn't hear it the first time, or you didn't know that when the teacher was talking to the class, it also meant she was talking to you, that asking them for clarification or asking the teacher to repeat what they just said is okay. We don't want to punish our kids for having memory and communication challenges, right? And so you might want to tell the teacher too in your child's life that asking for help is okay in your home, and that you hope in the classroom that it's okay as well. That way, when your child needs help, they'll ask for help appropriately from the teacher, right? Instead of maybe avoiding a task and having a temper tantrum, having a behavior because they're frustrated. We want to show them appropriate ways of asking for support and asking for help. You can also model that too, right, by doing it yourself. But with someone with FASD, it's better to just tell them that asking for help is okay, and then you can even show them different ways that they can ask for help, maybe from their teacher or from their coach. And even later on in life, when they're in college, or if they go to university, and they see other kids getting accommodations, maybe there's another young adult in the classroom that's getting a computer or getting maybe a scribe service, and your child with FASD might think, well, it's okay for them to have that, but it's not okay for me to have that. We don't want them to feel that way. We want them to advocate for themselves whenever they need support, and we want to show them how to do it appropriately. Okay, the next area that may be affected is executive functioning. And what executive functioning is managing yourself and your resources to achieve a goal. We see more challenges with executive functioning as your child has to start to manage their lives more independently. So when your child starts middle school is probably when we start to see deficits in executive functioning in a child with FASD, because they have to start managing themselves more during their day. So in the past, when they were in grade school or elementary school, the teacher told them what book to take out of and put on their desk for the next subject. In middle school, now they have to leave one classroom, go back to the locker, grab the appropriate books for the next class. All of that navigation that they do independently requires executive function skills. And so if your child has difficulty with executive function, that's where we're going to start to see some deficits. So a child with FASD may have difficulty with being on time. That goes hand in hand with that abstract concept, a challenge. Knowing how long something will take, again, time. Knowing what to do first and in what order. So they might be given a book report assignment, and they agree to it, say, yeah, I can do that, I love reading. And then 2 weeks goes by and they haven't started, and it's due. And when we ask them, well, what happened? One of the issues may have been they didn't know what they needed to do first. And so we want to make sure that when they're taking on things with multiple steps, that A, they're able to do all the steps, but letting them know what's that first step that they need to do, and then even if they need it, helping them know what all the other subsequent steps will be. Which leads to, they might follow through on something, and then they might agree to something and then not be able to follow through on it. They didn't realize how long it would take, or they didn't know what they had to do first or in what order. Your child may have strengths in executive functioning, so they might have interests and strengths that require some executive functioning skills. So you want to make sure that you're also noting that. You may have a child that has a part-time job and they're able to get there on time, or during the part-time job they know where they need to be and what to do, and that all takes executive functioning. So you may want to write down what those particular strengths are. So again, executive functioning, we see those challenges more as they get older, sort of middle school age. And if you have to come up with a plan for your child, maybe they're going on their first sleepover, or they're staying for the weekend with grandma, and they're going to have to get themselves ready by themselves. They won't have you there to give them all the reminders that you give them. You may have to come up with a plan, right, with your child. And so you want to make sure that when you're coming up with plans with your child with FASD, that you keep them simple. And so you can even simplify plans by making them visual, so they can have maybe a little visual plan that they can easily refer back to when you're not there, right? You're not there to keep reminding them. You want to make sure that you just have the required amount of steps in a plan that you're coming up with your child. So you want to lessen the amount of steps. The less steps a plan has, the more successful, the more likely it will be that it'll be successful and carried out. The more steps you have in a plan, the less likely it will be that it will be carried out successfully, right? So you want to make sure that you're ensuring some kind of success with your child, and that way, and also build up their confidence. So you want to lessen the steps and make it as simple as possible. It could be that lessening the amount of steps includes you doing some of the steps for them at first. Over time, you might be able to fade yourself away. And when you're coming up with a plan with your child that does have multiple steps, you want to make sure that they already know how to do all those steps, right? You don't want to assume that they know every step, even if they tell you they do. So by making sure that they know each steps, you might see that one step is actually a new skill that you have to teach before you move forward with a plan or a schedule. These are some visuals, a simple aid that you can use with a plan. So perhaps your child is going away for the first time and they're going to have to brush their teeth on their own without having you there to help them along. And so this might be a really nice visual that they can easily refer back to when they're on their own. This is another visual schedule for a routine. This could be a nighttime routine for maybe perhaps a younger child. You could even use this in your home as well, that they can easily refer back to it. What's nice about that is at the end of the routine, there's something maybe that is highly preferred for your child, like a story, so that they know that once they get this whole routine done, that there is something nice that will happen at the end. These visuals can be adjusted depending on your child's age or development. A lot of families that we work with at Surrey Place, have told us that their child with FASD is probably at the maturity level of a child, maybe give or take 2 years younger than them. So there's some dismaturity that they see, and so when you're adjusting these visuals, depending on your child's development. And you can also add text to visuals. When you're coming up with plans, you want to make sure that you plan together. Include them as much as possible. And that will give you an opportunity to ask them, through all the steps of the plan, what their concerns are and where they think they need help and what kind of help that they need. That helps you make the plan successful and lets you know where they need the help, but it also starts to build that skill in your child where they're able to self-advocate, right? They're able to tell people, hey, whoa, I'm going to have trouble with this step. I'm going to need help on this step. You want them to have that skill when you're not there. Maybe they're at work and they need help, right? So instead of them being unsuccessful at a job or a part-time job, and they walk out because they're overwhelmed or they don't want to go back the next day, it's good to start to set them up so that they have that skill where they're actually able to ask for help when they're not able to do something, instead of doing it inappropriately, like walking out or not going back to work. Which leads us to taking the shame out of not knowing something. Especially In Toronto, where Surrey Place is, there's a lot of A-type personalities here, and everyone is very success-focused, and some of us may feel uncomfortable letting other people know when we don't know something. We don't want kids with FASD to feel that way. We want to take the shame out of not knowing something so that they'll feel more comfortable asking for help, asking for support. Collaborate with your child. Work with your child, right? You want to keep open lines of communication with your child at all times during a plan, again, so that you're building up that skill for your child to advocate for themselves and to let people know when they need help, and start to develop skills too about knowing what kind of help they need in certain areas. And many reminders. So if your child or teen is starting a new job or has appointments where they're going off on their own to the appointment, you want to make sure that you feel comfortable and you're giving them reminders and doing it in a very supportive and generous manner, and letting them know when you're going to give them reminders, right? So they feel comfortable and they don't feel like you're sort of maybe nagging them, but letting them know when you go to your appointment at 11 o'clock tomorrow, I'm going to call you at 15 minutes before that to let you know when to put on your coat, right? And that could be a really good reminder, because they might think, oh, at 11 o'clock on my appointment, when I should be leaving for my appointment, that's when I'm going to put on my coat, brush my teeth, shower, and do all those things. And so we want to help them realize that those things take time, and we could do that by providing them with some reminders, right? Oh, you should be getting in the shower now. Now would be a good time to brush your teeth. Now would be a good time to put on your coat, and those kinds of things. And then it kind of builds a routine. And we're seeing that kids with FAC, the way that they learn the concept of time, or the way they kind of wrap their heads around time, is through set routines. So instead of saying at 10:15 you should be getting in the shower, it's better to say things like, when you brush your teeth in the morning and then you come down for breakfast, well, in between brushing your teeth and coming down for breakfast, that's when you should be taking your shower. And that way, because it's in a set routine, it's kind of built in their brain, it's a lot more easier for them to grasp in this abstract concept of time. This is a quote from Dr. Ross Greene. He's the author of The Explosive Child. He's a big proponent of collaborating with your child on strategies when they're having difficulty or they're having behaviors. Kids do well if they can. And what he's saying here is kids usually behave properly when they have the skills to be in a certain situation, right? So kids tend to misbehave or have tantrums when they're in situations where they're having difficulty, not because they're being lazy or because they want to cause trouble. It's usually because they're reacting in a negative manner, of course, but they're reacting to not having the proper skills to be in a certain situation. So we might see kids having behaviors every time a certain or particular situation pops up. So what that probably means is that in that situation, they don't have the proper skills. And so what Dr. Greene would propose is that with the child and with other adults involved in that situation, we come up with a way where we can support the child as best we can in those situations. And part of supporting the child is teaching them some skills, right, to better adapt to that situation, or some skills to get through the situation appropriately. And when they have those skills, they do well. So kids do well if they can. We talk a lot these days about secondary challenges or secondary impacts, and what those are challenges that aren't present at birth but can occur as a result of a disability or as a result of disabilities. And when we talk to parents at Surrey Place, parents that are taking care or raising children with FASD, some of the secondary challenges they tell us about are things like, my child is always frustrated, or my child is very anxious, rigid, shut down. And also what can happen when a child's actions or behaviors keep being misinterpreted over time, and they're being called lazy or dishonest or even liars or oppositional. Over time, when someone gets those labels thrown at them, they can have low self-worth. And when someone has low self-worth, they're less likely as adults to be motivated to try new things, to learn new things, and also to become effective self-advocates, right? So they may not think that they deserve certain things or deserve support, and they're less likely to ask for help appropriately if they have low self-worth, because they may not feel that they're worth it. Everyone, including people that have a diagnosis of FASD, deserves success and deserves to have an engaged and interactive and exciting life. And so we want to make sure that we're seeing some of these challenges for what they are. They're due to the fact that someone has FASD, and that we're supporting our family members and our children and teens and young adults with FASD as best as we can. This is a quote that I found on a really cool set of cards that I have from FASD iBites. On one card it says oppositional and then confused or overwhelmed. And I really like that because a lot of times we label kids with FASD as being oppositional or difficult or lazy or incapable of telling the truth. But really, when a child with FASD is being oppositional, what could be happening is that they're confused or they're overwhelmed, and they don't mean it personally that they're doing something that's not what you want them to do at this time, maybe being defiant. They might be confused or overwhelmed in that situation. As parents, we might come home after a long day of work and yell at someone. We're drained of energy. We might not be able to take any more bad news or something, and we throw a phone down on the table or what have you. And most people would say, oh, that person's overwhelmed, or they're drained of energy. They've had it. They're running on empty. Well, it's the same thing with a child. If they're being oppositional, it may not be something personally against you. It could be that they're confused right now, or their brain is overloaded, or they feel very overwhelmed, and moving forward is very difficult for them, and so they might act out. We want to keep that in mind. Instead of saying that someone's oppositional, it could be that in this particular situation that they need support.
Your feedback is very important to us. Please take a moment to complete the survey. Thank you very, very much for listening to the presentation. We hope that you found it helpful.